Next up, we have a deep dive panel on evaluating urban heat island mitigations using satellite-based thermal imagery. So this is a really wonderful combination of emerging technology and tools with a really critical need and application area in our neighborhoods and looking across the range of socioeconomic situations that are reflected in the built environment in these neighborhoods. To host this conversation, please welcome one of our Edge and Tech students who will soon graduate with a major in computer science. Aaron Kramer will kick off the conversation with Dr. Glenn Hulley, a physicist in the Carbon Cycle and Ecosystems Group at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and Greg Spots, the Chief Sustainability Officer and Executive Officer of StreetsLA. Over to you, Aaron.
It is really exciting to join the conference and to be able to moderate such interesting topics for this deep dive conversation. So I'm really excited to introduce Greg and Glenn, who are here to present their research and work regarding urban heat islands and satellite-based imagery, which is really exciting, and I can't wait for everyone to hear about it. Glenn, would you mind kicking us off with a little introduction?
Sure. For some reason, I could not get my virtual background like Greg has, or you, or you guys have right now as well. But anyways, you'll have to see what my bedroom looks like. Yeah, it's great to see everyone here. My name's Glenn Hulley. I'm a scientist at the NASA Jet Propulsion Lab here in Pasadena, California. And my main goal on the lab and my main sort of research drive is to use thermal infrared data, which we acquire from NASA satellites, and also airborne data to derive what we call the land surface temperature. And from the land surface temperature data, we can do a lot of different types of science, from monitoring climate change to studying how droughts affect plants and ecosystems. And then, with regard to our session today, we can use it to quantify urban heat island effects and heat stress and vulnerability in terms of human health. So I hope you guys will enjoy our little interaction today. And we do have a couple of slides to show as well. So that'll sort of help drive some of the conversation, hopefully.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. Greg, how's it going? And would you mind introducing yourself?
So I'm Greg Spots with the City of Los Angeles Public Works Department, Bureau of Street Services. I'm our executive officer and chief sustainability officer, and I've held those roles since 2015. Our mission is to, improve quality of life by making LA more walkable, bikeable, transit friendly, and greener. But recently we've brought in a whole new work stream of looking at urban cooling. And, we really think that we're among the cities in the United States leading on this topic. And we got to a critical point in 2020 where we'd put out some pilots on the street of cool pavement coatings, and we needed to prove that they actually cooled down the neighborhood. And that's when this partnership with NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory came to fruition. And it's really been just an absolutely critically valuable way to educate the policymakers and attract larger scale funding to make urban cooling a program rather than just some small pilots.
That is very exciting. Thank you so much for introducing yourself and the importance of the project. With that said, why don't we talk about the problem space a little bit? Why should people care about the surface temperature of the Earth?
So I can give you some examples, basically just based on our some of our intro slides here. But the surface temperature of the Earth is obviously a very important parameter that determines all kinds of things. For example, the habitats of different animal species and plants, and if they can thrive in different temperatures or not. For climate change, it's extremely important. So in this example that we had at JPL, a study at JPL where we looked at heat waves of the last 100 years, we could see that, especially in Southern California urban regions, that they were increasing at pretty rapid rates, especially in the 21st century. You can see on the left here that they're increasing dramatically in frequency, and then also their duration. They're getting to be, almost week-long events now. And then Greg likes to show this slide as well, which shows that this is a UCLA modeling study.
I can jump in and explain the concept as it pertains to LA while Glenn is trying to show the slides. So LA is very large, 500 square miles, lots of different neighborhoods, many different microclimates. In the northern rim of our city, at the edge of the San Fernando Valley near the mountains, we have communities that currently have 30 to 45 days a year where the peak temperature is over 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, in those neighborhoods, the number of days that hot is going to double by 2040 to 2060. So today, where there may be 40, 45 extreme heat days, there's going to be 90 to 100 extreme heat days just in a matter of a few decades. And that's going to mean an increase in heat-related emergency room visits and deaths. We are a city that actually has heat-related deaths in the winter. We can have a hot, humid, still air mass appear in January or February. People aren't prepared and people end up in the hospital. So mitigating urban heat is not primarily about reducing people's air conditioning use and the carbon emissions associated with that. Rather, mitigating urban heat is about reducing the future growth in heat-related emergency room visits and deaths.
That is incredibly important, and it sounds like very interesting work. So we can see from the slides some of the data that you just mentioned regarding heat and the projections in the future, which are very not optimistic. So we can definitely see why there's a big need for this urban cooling project. Wow, that's a startling graphic. So would you mind explaining what urban cooling is a little bit more? What are the techniques of it, and how can it be implemented?
Sure. So, a number of the levers that you can pull to mitigate urban heat pertain to my department, StreetsLA. We're the shade tree people. We manage an urban forest of 700,000 street trees along the sidewalks and parkways in the city. We also manage the bus shelter contract, which provides shade structures at bus stops. And right now that's an advertising supported contract, which means an inequitable provision of those shelters. There's just more shelters in the places where advertisers deem those views more valuable, and we're about to change that by issuing a new contract. And then there's this emerging solution of cool roadway coatings, where you put a very thin gray coating on top of your black asphalt street, and it brings some measure of solar reflectance, so that instead of absorbing 90% of the sun's energy, the roadway might only absorb 70 or 65% of the sun's energy, reflecting some of it back into space. When we started putting on cool roadway coatings in 2017, we found that on a hot summer day, the surface temperature of that roadway was about 10 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than nearby uncoated black asphalt. But what we wanted to know was, does that affect the neighborhood at large? And that's where Glenn and his amazing tool aboard the International Space Station has proved to be so helpful.
Glenn, would you like to jump in and tell us about that amazing tool?
Sure. Sorry about that. I had the dreaded blue screen of death there. It's probably the first one I've had in more than 2 years, but anyways, it has to happen now. So yeah, if you don't mind going to slide 7, Erin. So you have the slides there, yeah. So EcoStress it's a thermal infrared sensor on the ISS currently that provides the highest spatial resolution available from space to determine land surface temperatures. And that is around 70 to 100 meters, which you see in the larger image here. This is an example of an extreme heat wave that we experienced in 2020 over the LA area. And then what we've been able to do at JPL is to derive what we call a thermal sharpening model, where we take the original data here shown in the middle cutout, and then we sharpen it to higher resolutions using other different types of data sources. And so that really allows us to start distinguishing differences between urban surfaces in the urban environment. So we can see temperature differences between freeways, green spaces, roofs, and so forth. And then if you go down to slide 11, you can see the result of that when we looked at the Winnetka neighborhood. This is one of the first neighborhood level streets that were painted by Greg and his team back in 2017, 2018. And so we used eco-stress data over this area to show that and here in this inset cutout, you can definitely see this arc of cooler temperatures in the vicinity of Winnetka Drive, where they applied this cool sealed pavement. And what is encouraging to see is that not only the temperature of the streets were cool in this image, but it's the surrounding neighborhoods to within 100 meters or so also felt the cooling effect from the streets. And, you know, Greg can go on about this image, but he's used it a number of times now in stakeholder meetings and so forth. And it's helped them secure additional funding for streets that they're currently painting in more underdeserved parts of LA. And Greg can go on about that in more detail.
Yeah, you know, I used to be a management consultant, and I've made a lot of PowerPoint slides in my life. And the slide that I made with Glenn's imagery, I call the $6 million slide, because it attracted $4 million in cool pavement coating and $2 million in funding for tree planting along those blocks. And it's really the most sort of impactful slide that I've ever made. The policymakers just found this wildly intuitive, that we painted a crescent-shaped street, and you can see this cool crescent from space. And you know, there's nothing like the credibility of NASA. What brand in America has the credibility of NASA? I mean, you know, it makes sense. The spatial imaging, you know, imagine putting that. There's something very fair and you know, even-handed about this remote imaging. But I tell you, when it's attached to the brand name NASA JPL, it carries a whole lot of weight. So we took this funding, and right now we're implementing 200 city blocks of cool pavement in 8 Cal-Enviro-screen underserved neighborhoods across Los Angeles, and planting up to 2,000 trees along those blocks and neighboring blocks. So we went from small spec to get more money next year. Very happy to say, and this is the first time I've said this, last night when the US Senate passed the omnibus bill to fund the federal government through the end of the current fiscal year, there were 2 $1 million earmarks for urban cooling in Los Angeles. One in the Fairfax neighborhood and one in Boyle Heights. So let's now call it the $8 million slide, Glenn.
That's great. The more money, the better, right? And if you go to slide 13, you can see the locations of the neighborhoods that Greg just mentioned there.
We've used some really sophisticated GIS-based mapping tools to spatially analyze the city. We've looked at tree canopy. We've looked at exposure to heat. We've looked at access to the healthcare system. We've looked at socioeconomic factors, which are encapsulated in the Cal-Enviro-screen map. And we've layered all that together to make sort of a heat map of where the best places would be, the places of greatest need. It's super relevant today. You know, there's such an emphasis now on equity and, you know, investing in neighborhoods where we may have disinvested or ignored in the past. And a very sobering thing about LA is the tree canopy map mirrors the maps of redlining. So the places where it was impossible to get a loan to buy a house or fix up an apartment building starting in the 1930s, There's now a 90-year legacy where those places have less tree canopy and now therefore more heat exposure than the places where you could get financing.
And if I can just interject there, sorry, Greg, if you can go to slide 8, Aaron, I actually have a map of those redlining areas that Greg was talking about there. And so you can see that, you know, apart from some outliers here around Santa Monica along the coast, most of them fall in sort of the densely urbanized areas of LA and downtown Southeast LA. And if you go to the next slide, I actually overlaid an average eco-stress temperature map. This is using all of the eco-stress data ever acquired since 2018 during afternoon hours during the summertime. So this is maximizing, you know, the highest temperatures that we usually see in LA. And it'll be, I guess, tough to do, but if you go back and forth, you can see a lot of those redlining areas occur in these red high temperature spots that eco-stress has identified. And then if you go to slide 10 and you actually pull out the temperatures from those redlining areas, which here we classified as lower class, and then the other areas as upper to middle class, you can see a very distinctive warming in those areas of upwards of 8 degrees on average, but you know, anywhere between 10 and 12 degrees maximum. So they are definitely warmer during these summertime periods. And
that's an amazing slide, Glenn. When did you make that slide? This was the first time I've seen it when you circulated the deck this morning.
Yeah, so this is actually literally yesterday. You know, we're working on a NASA proposal right now to try and provide more of this data to Greg and other stakeholders in an equity and environmental justice call that NASA has just put out. So NASA is actually providing funding exactly for this type of work right now, which is really encouraging. And so, you know, this was just an example slide we put together for the proposal just to show that indeed these areas are experience much warmer temperatures during the summertime here in LA.
That's very powerful. I can't wait to use that. If you don't mind, let me use it.
Yeah.
Should we talk a little bit about how we met and how one could make such a partnership? Aaron, do you want to lead that part of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of building off of your sharing of slides a little bit. Y'all are definitely very supporting, y'all depend and support on each other, which is a really exciting thing. Often science can be siloed and public works can be siloed, and the collaboration that effectively makes gets funding and makes actual change doesn't occur. So this is a really exciting project because of the combination between NASA and the city of Los Angeles. So could you speak a little bit to how you two met and how this collaboration started?
Sure. So, you know, I went to a symposium, a morning symposium on the use of social media, and it was at the Paramount Studio lot in LA, and NASA was one of the presenters. And they talked about their public-facing mission and how they put out information and how the Mars rovers have their own Twitter accounts and everything. I found it super fascinating. I'm like a lifelong space enthusiast. And I got a conversation going with someone from NASA outside the event afterwards. And she turned out to be like a civil engineer who was part of the facilities group. And she'd heard of our urban cooling work. And she said, you know, would you be interested in presenting on Quill Pavement, you know, to our facilities team? And, you know, I was like, I would just be interested in getting a tour of JPL, you know, presenting at JPL would be amazing. So on that day, I get brought to this little conference room, windowless conference room, maybe 15 seats. And the other guy presenting is Glenn right here. And I guess the really special part is we did something after that. We could have both presented and thought we had some common interest in shared business cards, but somehow, you know, we really built something after that. What was your feeling at that moment, Glenn, about, you know, how we might be able to partner?
Yeah, so at that point, I think it was the end of 2019. I was actually just looking back at some dates, and you know, in late 2018, you know, when EcoStress, this EcoStress mission launched, we were highly encouraged to look for, you know, direct applications benefits of the data, especially societal applications. And so at the time, I was doing a lot of research on urban heat islands and urban climate. And I thought this was like a golden opportunity to actually use some of our data to try and assess and quantify, the cooling impacts of Greg's work. And, from there, we've collaborated since. And unfortunately, I haven't been fully funded to support Greg and, work like this, but, hopefully with future calls and NASA funding, we'll be able to, develop an even stronger partnership. And it's really these kind of partnerships that are currently critical so that, policymakers can use actual data-driven recommendations for their sustainability and mitigation efforts.
Yeah, and let me just add, it's a nice story in that I thought it was like a once in a lifetime opportunity to work with NASA, but NASA really wanted to work with ground level people like us, who actually have the power to implement stuff. And I didn't know that. And like an interesting message to the attendees here is like, put yourself out there, because you don't know who you're going to meet. And you don't know if they're going to turn out to be as interested in you as you're interested in them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and on that point, there's no big mystery in this data. It is publicly available. NASA have an very open data policy with no restrictions. So all the data, for example, that I've shown you today is freely and publicly available from websites such as the LPDAC and others, Earth Data Search, for example. And NASA is really encouraging this now as well, and encouraging citizen scientists to go out there and look at the data themselves.
That's really incredible. So is there any plans to make the data more accessible so that it's easier to access, or it's easier to use from a more amateur level as opposed to a citizen science level?
Yeah, that's a pretty good question, because I guess the daunting part of this is that the NASA data are wrapped in these special formats called HDF5 formats, and that can be a little bit daunting at first to someone who's never programmed before, or is not sure where to actually find the data and all the scaling factors and everything else. And so as an example, this proposal that I'm working on right now, what we plan on doing is outputting the data in more GIS, geospatial information system software, friendly data formats such as GeoTIFF and so forth, where you would literally open the file and it would display the data on a map for you immediately. And so this is something that we're going to be packaging up for our external partners in this hopefully future project. And so the plan is to work with Greg and his team, Climate Resolve here in LA, the Smart Surfaces Coalition, Global Cool Cities Alliance, and we're going to be making this data much more easily usable for these external organizations.
That sounds like an incredibly exciting project. We only have a few moments left, so are there any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave our attendees with?
Yeah, I just wanted to share that, I've been thinking a lot lately about, how can each of us have the greatest impact, on climate from our little corner of the way we work on it. And, to make our cities adapt to this warming world, we're going to have to innovate faster along more dimensions than has ever happened in history. And part of that is sharing your story. If you're innovating and you're not telling anybody, then you're not doing enough. Because we don't have time for it to take 10 years for a cool pavement to gradually diffuse around the United States. So, it's helped me to be more assertive in my sort of public speaking, social media, thought leadership, because you don't have to think about it as marketing yourself or selling anything. You can think about it as sharing innovations to help inspire and legitimize other people to do innovation. And I think that that's very exciting, the idea of all of us really, connecting to more people faster than we ever have before with how we can, go about this massive set of tasks.
And I guess I could just add to that by saying, you shouldn't just leave it up to cities to implement these cooling strategies. You can do it yourself as a citizen. go out and find there's cheap thermal cameras around that you can find on Amazon, for example, that just hook into your iPhone these days and identify warm areas around where you live, even where it be your roof or, an open parking lot. And, there you can go and buy cool reflective paints now at Home Depot if you want. You can paint your own roof. One of my friends just did that in San Fernando Valley and reduced his roof temperatures by up to 30 degrees. Doesn't use as much air conditioning during the summertime now. So there are definitely, I think citizens need to get involved as well, to be aware of heat in the city and your surrounding.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for leaving us with those words of inspiration and hope for the future. Thank you so much for sharing your work and research with us, Camille.
Thank you, Aaron and Greg and Glenn. That was so exciting. I loved that presentation. Your work is so impressive, and we'll hope to see it scale across major cities elsewhere in the United States. I really appreciate how you called out the health effects of the urban heat waves and the use of new tools, including those from space, the International Space Station, to monitor ground temperatures. It's amazing. I also love to see the partnership that you really highlighted between NASA, large federal agency, and the city level public works department. It was wonderful, as well as encouraging people to get involved, the opportunities for citizen science projects. And I also at the end appreciated your encouragement for a diverse set of voices to be communicators about these issues, and to think of it not as self-promotion, which if we think about a diversity of personalities, maybe introverts would be less comfortable with that, but if you really think about it as advocating on behalf of your environment, your neighborhood, the planet, all of those things can be quite motivating. So thank you.